Welcome to part 2 of the bull skull mural video. So in this video we're going to continue to render the bull skull mural. Make sure you check out part 1 if you haven't already. This is a 2-part series, so part 1 will show you all the steps prior to this and how we've built the textures and shadows to get it up to this point. Now what we're doing is I'm using a Derwent electric eraser. Any eraser, electric eraser that is, will do the trick. So what I want to do is, using these Createx illustration colors, you can actually rework them, which I think I spoke about in part 1 of this video. And the idea and the good thing about that is that I can now come in and I can remove some of that paint. And by removing that paint, I'm getting these sort of textures that are happening. You can see here I'm just sort of doing a bit of a squiggly circular motion and allowing the eraser to almost sort of bounce around by its own force. If you can imagine, it's just spinning around quite quickly every time I'm pushing that button, and it creates it, makes it bounce around a little bit. So look, any sort of uneven movement will create an effective texture. Now with the skull, it needs to be uneven just to give that sort of appearance. So you can see now I'm going over certain areas to get them brighter, and you'll work out your own little methods. But the idea of this is basically to get that white to show back through and to have that unevenness. And then what I'll do is, with that illustration decay color, and also when we move on to the sepia in the final tone, it will then sit on top of that. And because they're transparent, you're going to get that shining through. So those colors will sit on top, but when you look through them, you're going to see that texture, which is really cool. So you can see I've just zoomed back a bit to show you how it's looking so far. So we're just continuing all of the texture here on the eye sockets. So I'm basically just picking up on the highlights. So you can see in these dark areas here, which I explained to you earlier in part 1 of this video, you can see how much detail I've got there. I haven't just blackened those eye sockets. I've actually created that depth so that it disappears back into the back of the eye socket, so it gives that 3D appearance. So what I'm doing now is just giving that uneven texture to the bone so it looks like it's all a bit dimpled, and then hitting out the highlights. So to get the real sharp highlights with the electric eraser, you need a relatively sharp eraser tip. So I did go through quite a few whilst doing the texturing on this mural. Again, because of the texture of the actual wall, it sort of ground the eraser tip down a lot quicker than it would, say, if you were using it on paper or illustration board. So yeah, pretty much just sharpen the tip of the electric eraser, or when you do put a brand new one in, the tips are usually squared off. So yeah, you can use the edge of that, which is pretty good, and you can actually get it fairly accurate. So once you get the feel for it. But generally it's just a real uneven sort of motion, and yeah, you can see now I've just replaced that tip, and it helps to get those defined sharp lines on the edges of the bone, especially this one that runs right down. So it's a really good way to get a bit more of a realistic effect within your paintings. So just remember to keep checking your light source. You don't just want to put these highlights everywhere. I mean, we will create further highlights later on in the video, going back to like the old bone white paint, just to really pick up some brighter spots. But that's just going to add to the effect. So this is predominantly just to get all your your main sort of areas, the brightest sections of the bone, especially where all the cracks are. You can see I'm highlighting the opposite side of the crack where it would, before it dips down, straight after that you've got that highlight on that sort of jagged, sharp edge. So pretty much just jump between your reference and also a bit of artistic license. And just sort of randomly put them in different areas and build up a bit of texture on your bone. You don't have to totally cover everything with the electric eraser as with the texture. You can sort of do sections and your eye tends to fill in the gaps. So you can see now there's some texture there on the main part of the skull. Sort of working it in. So just continuing those areas, building up more texture as you go, alternating between using the side of the eraser tip and doing a sort of front on flatter sort of texturing effect, which helps to sort of blend it out as well. So once your tip gets a bit smoother, you can see it's really effective for the actual holes in the bones. You kind of do one side and brighten it up with a highlight, and then your shadows on the outside. So you can see now there's quite a bit that's been added. And kind of the more uneven that you are, the better it's going to look. So try not to get them too uniformed. So even with these little cracks here, pick out the areas and the edge of that highlight. If you want any bits to be brighter, just go over it a few more times. You can see I'm just going back over that highlighted line, but it's really starting to give it that 3D effect. Now the reason we wait till the sort of second last tone to do this is because it works better if you've got a bit of a darker shadow to texture on top of, because it's actively removing that back to the white. So you'll notice that if it's just on a lighter section, it doesn't really show up as well. So just get as much in as you can, and then come back and rework sections that you need to get a bit brighter, or you want to have a bit more texture on them, or even it up like the one above there, which looks a bit scribbly at the moment, but I'll come back to that and fix that up. Remember to keep stepping back to and checking on how you're going. You get a better perspective when you step away from the artwork. So you can see now how that's really starting to look a bit more like bone. So now that all that texturing is done, Just masking up the rest of the tip of the horn there. And we're going to get some black on the tip of the horn. Now the reason for this is, as I mentioned, the customer that we're doing it for, Willow and Ivory Studios, they wanted to have a silver horn. So what I did was I'm putting a black base down so that the silver will sit on top of that. So I'm going to be using the Wicked Silver, and it's a pearl silver, but it does need a black base so that you've got a bit of a flip. So even on the video it's very hard to tell, you'll see later on when I add it in, but by putting a black base down it's going to stand up a lot more than what it would normally if you just based over a white or a lighter colour. So keep that in mind. It's a good trick for all sorts of metallics. It does sort of help to put a black base down in most cases. So I'm pretty much just coating that in. The reason I taped up around it was I just didn't want any of the overspray to travel. So it was just using my HPCR Revolution from Iwata. So you can see it's a nice even tone that you can pump on with that. And just get good coverage. And then I'll be adding the pearl silver, which is predominantly almost like transparent when you're putting it on, so it takes a few coats to cover. So just coated it on there then, and you can see how it's got that reflection, that bit of a flip. Whereas other angles it looks almost black, so that's the effect that we wanted. So now going back to the airbrushing, we're now I'm just adding with that old bone white, that illustration colour, I'm adding all the highlights back in and working on top of what I've achieved by scratching back. So this is to add to what I've just done with the electric eraser. Now generally I usually pretty much almost go white highlights, second last tone. So I'll have a final tone after this. The reason being is white, although this isn't a true white, it's more of an off-white bone colour, but even if you're using a true white, it's always good to do it the second last tone so that your final tone can be nice and sharp and eliminate any of the white overspray that you may get. White does tend to show up quite easily and you get that real foggy look, so that's why I find it works for me that if I do the highlights at the second last tone, that final last tone can always eliminate any overspray that I may have. So that's why you'll see me do that in most of my artworks. If there is any sort of highlights to be put in at the end, extreme white highlights, and they need to go over the dark tone, for instance, if you're doing the iris, of an eye, and just you want to get that dot white highlight in there, and you need the dark base underneath that, well then you'll do that last. So that would come in at the end. You can still do it the tone before the final tone, but just go back over it at the end. So again, just adding the extreme white highlights and just fogging it in certain areas, up close in other areas, depending on what section of the bone I'm working on. The flatter sections like this, I want that dimply sort of bone effect, so I'm fogging that in, whereas up on the edges there, where it joins up to the horn, I'm a lot closer, and what I'll do is I'll run a fairly bright white highlight and then I'll blend it out. So it gives that 3D appearance, and it gives the appearance that the light's just hitting that spot. and the edge of the bone is picking up on your highlight. So just keep working all that in. So you can see now I'm running some real bright white highlights just to really pick up on the edges of the bone where the cracks are. So you can see I'm up fairly close in these sections because I want it to be pretty bright. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I do tend to jump from spot to spot. That way it tends to help with your irregularities. You don't tend to just work on one section and repeat a pattern or an area or a technique of spraying the white highlights. If you jump around quite a bit, then you tend to keep it a bit more uneven, which is the look that we're going for. So just picking up on any of those really important highlights in the eye sockets there to give that 3D effect. So nice bright white highlight on that side. And then just fogging a little bit more into the head of the skull there. Just on the flatter sections, really brightening those up. So it gives that sort of bleached bone appearance. Obviously, because this is a larger scale mural as opposed to say doing this on a on a Harley rear fender, a mural that's tinier is gonna, you're still going to include all the details, but when it's a mural at this scale, you can really go to town on adding all those little details and textures and bits and pieces. So it's important to take your time and put as much in as possible and just make it look as realistic as you possibly can. So now we're just going to work on the horns here, add a few of the real bright white highlights to get again that unevenness in the horn. So generally I would run that right up towards the tip, but like I said, in this case we wanted that to be fairly flat and silver, so it's going to remain the way it is there. Just doing a combination there of dot white highlights and relatively tight dagger strokes just to get some shape in that area there where the horn comes out from the skull. So continue working in the highlights there. So I'm just working on the other horn. Same sort of thing, dot white highlights, some dagger strokes. And then just going back to the main part of the skull, and I tend to build the white as well, so instead of trying to get it in one hit, just build it up. You can see now I'm switching to illustration sepia and my CMSB airbrush. I just like this for the finer details. It's got a 0.18mm needle, so you can get nice and fine. So I basically thin the illustration sepia a fraction, maybe 10%, run it through a strainer straight into the side cup of the SB. You've just got to be careful, obviously, it is an open cup, so you've got to be careful not to spill it, but I usually just use this, well, I do just use this airbrush to detail with, so I'm just nice and careful with it, not throwing it around, but it just gives you really, really fine detail. You can also get a side cup with a lid on it, and some bigger side cups as well than the one that comes in the kit, so keep that in mind for people that are totally scared or do not like using a side cup airbrush. Well, that sort of solves that problem. You can get additional cups and whatever, and you know, ones with lids if it freaks you out a little bit, but you tend to get used to it. So just adding in as much detail. You can see how that's cleaned up everything and given it a lot more depth. So as I'm going nice and sharp, I'm also shading back into the areas that I want shadowed out, so it gives that 3D effect again. Just take your time. This is the step that takes the longest, so it's a matter of just gradually going along, getting nice, sharp, clean areas where you need them to be clean, and then dusting out and darkening any areas that are in shadow. So keep referring back to your reference and think about where your light source is coming from. So you can see I've gone quite a bit darker there because I'm just putting some uneven texture in there as well into the bone. It's starting to look curved and nice and 3D. Again, I'm going lighter and then gradually going darker. I'm not just going full solid colour. Just continue detailing here with the sepia colour. So I'm going to be adding more texture as well with this tone. So even dusting over some of the areas that I've removed using the electric eraser, it'll just create that extra depth. And then obviously accentuating all the overall tones to make it appear more three-dimensional. So just make sure that you sort of stay away from where you've put the white highlights, because you don't want it to appear muddy, which can be a result of spraying a darker colour over a lighter one. So just take your time, just shaping everything. Remember, all these techniques can be used for any type of skull. It doesn't particularly have to be a bull skull. Even the toning to get that bone effect using a combo of these colours will work, or you can mix up your own. And like I said earlier, if you do need to add more tones into it to make it a bit easier for you to airbrush, then by all means do that. So you can see now I'm just deepening those sockets. Picking out as much detail as possible. And trying not to just blur everything out, being nice and sharp where I have to be, controlling the overspray, deepening the cracks. You can see how close the airbrush is here. Even if it's a large scale mural, and I like to get nice and close to really get those sharp details in, and then from a distance I'm dusting back out and blending those tones. But I'm still leaving some of the other previous tones as well. You're not just coating over everything. The idea of using, say, 2 or 3 different tones or even more is that you get a gradation of colour. You don't want to just eliminate it all with your final tone, otherwise it's pretty much pointless going through all the other steps. So just slowly but surely, this colour you should, as you go on, it's what I always tell my students, is that generally you should be painting less with each tone. It will take longer to do it because you're being sharper and more cautious. But this particular colour, your final tone, you should actually paint less of the mural using that, because you do not want to eliminate all of your previous colours. So it's something to keep in mind. So really going back to that whole less is more. You know, you can always go darker, but it's very, very hard to go back over the top and fix it. So just take your time. Just putting in more and more details. Moving back into another area, working on a few more of those cracks. So again, you can see I do jump around quite a bit. I don't just stay in one spot. Defining a few more of those cracks. And cleaning up any sort of lines or shadows that I didn't like prior. And also adding in more just texture effects and bits and pieces by fogging in certain areas. And you can see there I'm focusing more on getting that real nice sharp defined line for the socket of the eye. So you can see I'm steadying myself with my other hand. Helps to guide my airbrush. So I'm not just using one hand and going for it. This works really well if you're doing a small mural on, say, a Harley tank, but I would recommend wearing a glove. But you can actually rest up against it and then just slightly move that airbrush, and you've got your guide there, you know how far away you are, rather than trying to do it all with not touching the surface. But yeah, you always need to remember to wear gloves, because you don't want to get any oils off your fingers onto the Harley tank prior to clearing it. So keep that in mind. For something like this, it's a wall mural, it doesn't make that much of a difference. So just adding some more textures in, gradually building the tones, fogging in areas and getting that overall uneven look. You know, often the airbrush does it so smoothly that you've got to sort of, to get that element of realism, you need to create those uneven tones, because the airbrush has that flawless capability to make a smooth blend and a transition. So if you make it a bit more uneven, especially for something like a skull and bone and those sort of textures, it does look really effective. Same as if you were to render, say, rock or granite. You don't want it all to be polished and smooth. You want it to be uneven. You know, a bit of a stippling effect and all sorts of other things in there. So, you know, different artworks will obviously need different sort of techniques used, but yeah, you know, this is just a way of building it up and making it look a bit more uneven. So, a real effective method, and then adding with the electric eraser, you can get really, really effective results. So, just experiment. If you've never done it, like I always say, do a test panel first before you attack a project, and make sure you're confident that the techniques are going to work. So again, I'm just working back into that area of the eye socket and some of those other cracks, just deepening them, and also blending out where the crack is. If you dust on it from a distance and run a slight, real subtle shadow, it gives that impression that the crack has made an impression in the bone. Okay, just keep adding all your finer details, take your time. Again, a combination of sharp shadows and subtler shading. Now I'm just working in these extreme joins here, shading them out so you get that real dip down in the center of the bone. Step back, have a look, make sure you're happy with the way it's coming across. And you can see there I'm spraying a bit to the side just to blend that out. This is all still using sepia. So illustration sepia straight out of the bottle with a bit of reducer. And by coating over it, you can get quite dark with the sepia tone. Really great fine detail colour to use. So you can see now just adding more and more details to those eye sockets and the bones. Now working back on the horn, shading the bottom section, and sort of softening those edges as well where it transitions into the black and the pearl silver. Adding a few more details, just deepening, running some sharper shadows. Just coming in and cleaning up any areas that you think needs a bit more attention. And it's looking like it's pretty much it. So now it's time to unmask and reveal the completed mural. So just gradually peel all your masking off. Be careful with this stage, just take your time. You You can already see it's got more of a 3D appearance. You know, it's really going to pop out from the background. So just be careful, you don't want to lift up anything or pull any of the paint off, but you can see now, see a little bit of that green tape where I went around some of the curved areas. The 3M green fine line tape works really well. So just removing any excess masking tape, get rid of that paper, and then peel off any of your other sections to reveal the mural. So just getting a quick photo and then continue to remove all your masking tape. You can see it's coming off pretty easy. Any sort of edges that have got a bit more paint build up like you saw there, I just used my finger slightly and rubbed any of that dried paint off where it's bridged across the masking tape. So just carefully remove everything. Only a few final areas to remove. So I hope you enjoyed the video and that you can use some of these techniques the next time you airbrush a bull skull or a skull in general. Hopefully some of the texturing ideas have helped, and the colour combinations and the overall techniques used. So just removing the last few bits. And there you have it. There's the completed mural. So just picking out the last few bits there. These were the areas that I had to mask up a little way through the first video. And you'll see why we masked them up now. You can see how the grey looks so much more effective. You can see through those areas. There you go. The completed artwork. Thanks again for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time.